All right, welcome everyone. Happy Thursday afternoon, in the middle of an excellent policy orientation. I am James Quintero. I'm the director of the Center for Local Governance at TPPF. By the way, I love the Lennons. They are my favorite. And we are here today to talk about ETJs. For those of you who may have wandered in by mistake, that stands for extraterritorial jurisdiction. And we're going to get into why those are important and what that means for a lot of people here in the great state of Texas. Now, when my team pitched me on this idea, I thought, whoa, this might be a little too technical. But as I got to thinking about it, there's a lot of really good stuff here. In fact, every day for the last 4 years, I have parked at the Capitol Visitors Parking Garage, for those of you who know the Texas Capitol. And on my way to and from work, I pass the Texas State Library and Archives building. And stamped right on the library building is a section from the Texas Constitution that says this: "All political power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their benefit." And those words, every time I see them, stir a lot of strong passion in me. And so when I thought about this issue of ETJ and what's at stake here and how that may interact with that particular section of the Texas Constitution, I thought this is absolutely the right topic. And we very much want to educate people on the issue. And so, to help me do that, I brought along 3 of the smartest people in the state of Texas. And I thought, rather than introduce them myself, I wanted to see if each gentleman could go on down the line, introduce themselves to the audience, and leave you guys up front with the one takeaway they want you to leave with. And so with that, Mike, would you start us off and introduce yourself and talk a little bit about the issue?
Absolutely. I'm Mike Schofield. Until Tuesday, I was the state representative for House District 132 in Katy and Cy-Fair in Harris County. Currently, I'm actually doing some work for my friend Pat Fallon, who has been elected to the Senate. We're all in favor of that. Okay, now I know where my Wichita Falls through Frisco people are. While I was in the legislature, and before that I worked for Governor Perry for 11 years, and amongst other things, my job included property rights and annexation and ETJs and eminent domain and all kinds of things like that. And so when I got into the legislature, I had a few things that I wanted to address. Ever since the Eisenhower years, as we've had highways going further from towns, cities have felt the need to grow out there to take in people who actually worked in the city and were actually part of the city, as opposed to creating a new city 20 miles away that people lived in. And that impetus shapes where we are today, but we're no longer in the Eisenhower era. And so things I think that we'll talk about will touch on that, how the extraterritorial jurisdiction and annexation laws that we put in place then to deal with a rapidly expanding state geographically really don't fit anymore. And so that's kind of my expertise, and that's what I'm here to talk about. And the one thing I want you to take away from this is we cannot continue to have the 1950s in perpetuity. We can't continue to have a system where a city just keeps growing further and further from its core to the point where it cannot govern the territory that it has. And we already see that in the city of Houston. Under our current law, where every time you annex, you get 5 miles more territory if you're a big city, there's nothing to stop Houston from going all the way to the New Mexico border. So that antiquated system no longer fits the 21st century. It no longer serves the people who live in those areas, and that is what I want you to remember when you leave here today.
Bill?
I'm Bill Fulton. I'm the director of the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice. We do a lot of work on urban and metropolitan governance issues in metropolitan Houston, if you look down what's been distributed to you, there are 3 maps from our shop. The top one is pretty much what was just described, which is the extraterritorial jurisdiction for the city of Houston. If you look at that map, the blue is the city boundary, the pink is the extraterritorial jurisdiction, which encompasses more than 1,000 square miles. We'll get into a lot of the detail, but my takeaway would be, yes, something has to change, but there is no magical solution. Even if the unincorporated territories are released, which are mostly governed for service provision by municipal utility districts, as you see on the other maps, even if they are released from the Houston ETJ, there are still long-term issues of infrastructure finance for those areas, particularly the older ones, and the bill is going to come due to somebody. And so part of the solution has to be not just to change the system and stop annexation. Houston's stopped annexing anyway, possibly to limit or shrink or eliminate the ETJ, but also find long-term financial solutions for service provision, particularly for the older subdivisions that are in the unincorporated area of Harris County and the surrounding counties in the Houston ETJ.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. Matthew?
Hi, working?
Good.
My name is Matt Festa. I'm a professor at the South Texas College of Law, Houston, in downtown Houston. And I'm also proud to be a fellow with the Rice Kinder Institute that Bill directs, but I'll let him promote the great work that they do. If you're not paying attention to the Kinder Institute's empirical and analytical studies, it's a really great organization with good work. So, but what I do is I teach state and local government and land use to law students and write and research in the area. I was just at the American Association of Law Schools conference last week. That's the Law Professors National Convention. And when I introduced myself as a land use professor from Houston, a lot of my fellow scholars from around the country said, well, that must be light lifting, right? Because there's no regulations in Houston. And well, as we all know here in this room, that's far from the case, right? So, what I'd like to maybe talk about a little bit is some of that outsider's perspective on ETJ, which is both somewhat unique to this region, but also fits within the context of what nationally is a growing trend towards state versus local conflict. In the scholarship, in the legal arena, litigation, there's so much conflict brewing between state and local governments. And in one sense, this issue seems to fit within that paradigm, but in another sense, it's, I guess, maybe be careful what we wish for. Because ETJ is a strange thing, but it's, as Bill mentioned, it addresses real-world issues that won't go away just because we reform the political alignments of state, local, and regional governance. So, one possible upshot of reforming ETJ, we're talking about annexation as sort of the backdrop of this. And to the extent that extraterritorial jurisdiction was partially conceived in this unique, this part of the country aspect of incorporated, big, growing incorporated municipalities versus unincorporated areas. But like Mike said, faced with the growth of the last 50 to 100 years, one possibility is more fragmentation, and I think that both progressives and conservatives might find some common ground in focusing a little bit more on regional solutions, regardless of there may be different ways to do the assortive figuring out of the political boundaries and financial boundaries, but regional problems aren't going to go away.
If we might, for those of you who are lost already, let's just take a minute to lay out what it is we're talking about before we get into the, and I can already see there's sort of two Rice guys over here and the unincorporated Harris County guy over here, so I can see how this is going to lay out. But let's talk about what it is. In order to have local government, as you know, the base government in every state is the state government, and the state creates municipalities, which we did in most cases long ago. We don't create a lot of new ones anymore. And so you start off with municipalities, and we have different types of those. And that actually matters in the case of extraterritorial jurisdiction and annexation, because home rule cities, any city with more than 5,000 people can vote to have a home rule charter, and then they set their own rules within limits for how they're going to govern themselves. And then we have general law cities who have to follow what state law says a city can do. And that includes in cases like extraterritorial jurisdiction. The Supreme Court of Texas has ruled that those cities have no authority in their extraterritorial jurisdiction. They can't tell you what to build on your property, and they can't tell you what you can and can't do, whereas a home rule charter city can. So we start with the premise that we have city limits, and you either choose to live in a city or not. And my district in Harris County, I'll tell you, folks assumed I represented Houston. I don't represent an inch of Houston. I represented 10,000 people in the city of Katy and 190,000 people in unincorporated Harris County. They don't have a mayor, they don't have a city council. So there were two concepts that we're going to bring in for those of you who aren't land use experts. One is annexation that we're not really talking about today, but that's where the actual city limits can grow. The city can grab more territory and incorporate it into its city, and that's what I referred to in my opening when we talked about Houston and other cities would expand geographically, reaching further out and taking in more territory that they then tax, which is why they like to do it, but they're also supposed to provide municipal services, which they might or might not. But in addition to that, we have the concept of extraterritorial jurisdiction, which we refer to as ETJ. And what that is land outside your city limits, a little ghost around your perimeter, where the city gets to have certain ability to regulate your land use and other things, in order that, theoretically, in order that it's on deck for annexation. And so what they didn't want was you to jump right into the next place to be annexed, put a bunch of substandard housing in, make your buck and get out, and then it gets annexed and the city's stuck with substandard housing. That's the basic concept. Cities like Houston have stopped annexing. Houston now, when it wants to get more money, does what's called a limited purpose annexation. They just go out to a MUD and they say, give me half your money or I'm going to annex you. I'm not going to provide any services. So it turns the purpose of a city or any government on its head. The purpose is to provide services. We allow them to collect taxes to provide those services. This is now, we will give you no services whatsoever. Give me your money because we want to spend it in downtown Houston. We want to spend it much closer to Rice University than where you live out in the Katy area. And so that's what they do. But
That's what, yes, you're right. The city of Houston in a limited purpose annexation and does in fact cut a deal with a MUD so that each side gets half of 1% of sales tax. The MUD still levies their own property tax. And you're right, it is the only way that the MUD can gain access to the sales tax. And you're right, the city does in fact extract the tax and provide no services. That's absolutely right. Currently, for the municipal utility districts, that total that is split between, in Harris County, between the MUDs and the city of Houston is about $88 million. Each side gets about $44 million. So the city of Houston is getting $40 to $50 million out of these areas without providing any services. That's absolutely right.
So now we come to the part that we're actually supposed to be talking about. I knew I would talk too much about the stuff that leads up to it, is the ETJ. And ETJ is a sliding scale based on the size of your city. If you live in a very small city, it can be a half a mile or a mile. When you get up to the big cities over 100,000, it's 5 miles. And over time, what we don't say is, this is the right size for your city, but right now you only have this, and as you grow, you can grow till you get to there. We don't say that. We say, your city limits are what they are, You have 5 miles all the way around you, which means in Houston, where they've extended a finger out, they get 5 miles all around that finger everywhere they go. And you can, each time you annex, you get 5 further miles. So not only do you grow, it's like telling a fat kid, the more donuts you eat, the more we're going to put on your plate. So cities get further and further from their core, and you get to the place where I've got people out in Katy who are 30 miles from Houston City Hall, and the city of Houston tells them what they can do with their property. In fact, the ETJ for the city of Houston almost entirely surrounds the city of Katy, and I have been at city council meetings where a citizen will go to the Katy City Council and say, I am directly across the street from your city limits on Pin Oak. If you would be so kind, I'd like you to annex me so you can provide me city water and sewer, and I can develop my property, my little strip mall or whatever I want to build. And they'll tell them, we'd love to extend our sewer and water across the street, but we can't. You're in Houston's ETJ. The guy went 30 miles into City Hall in the city of Houston, and they told him, you're so remote from us, we can't provide you services for 30 years. The man is sick. He's going to be dead before he can develop his property, but the city of Houston has some right to tell him what he can and can't do out there. And frankly, that isn't particularly useful. The city will tell you, well, you know, you need us to tell you what to do out there so you can have proper standards. My response is, thanks, but you don't have to live within the city's Houston city limits to be smart, and we kind of know what to do with our own property. But to sort of kick off the debate, the one point both of these gentlemen made was that if you just cut off the ETJ, and I had a bill to do that, you're still going to have to provide services. Something's going to have to happen. Here's my response to their statement. You may want to be in a city. You also may not. Millions and millions of Texans choose not to live in a city, so they live outside the city limits. They don't get the benefits. They also don't pay the taxes. That's their choice. But there's one choice you don't get to make if you're in an ETJ, and that's to govern yourself. And y'all aren't familiar with my neck of the woods, but out past Houston, where there used to be fields, and I don't mean when we were kids, I mean 2 years ago, there were fields, and now there are 1,000 houses. And I had 3 6A high schools built in 1 year in my district, within about 5 miles of each other. You went from prairie to built up. Well, those people who are going to number in the tens of thousands when all this is built up, they will never be able to decide, hey, we'd like to be our own city, the city of Bridgeland or the city of Cinco Ranch or any of those, because Houston comes in, grabs the tax money, and as a result, and I'm going on too long, I'm sorry guys, I just drank a cup of coffee right before we started, which is a bad idea. But as a result of that, they can never become a city, because even those that aren't in the ETJ, you cannot have a city just based on the tax base from the houses. You have to have the businesses, and Houston has already reached out its finger and grabbed all that money, and I'll tell you one thing, they don't spend it anywhere near us. So the people in Bridgeland who may one day decide that they'd like their mayor to be somebody they see at the HEB and not on television will never have that opportunity. That is not serving the public. Sorry guys, I just kicked the ball off.
I basically, even though I'm from Rice, I am a former mayor, and I fundamentally don't disagree with what Mike just said. I do think that in the long run, I mean, the whole ETJ system, as Mike explained it, and you explained it very well, is set up on the assumption that eventually the city annexes the property in the ETJ, right? With one or two exceptions, for the last 40 years, that has not happened in Houston, but Houston has not given up the ETJ, and there are a lot of reasons why. So I think that there are a lot of possible solutions, letting the ETJ go, creating a time-limited ETJ, either you annex in a certain period of time or it goes away. Up there, we recently did a report where we laid out quite a number of options. I think one of the points that Matt and I were making at the beginning is, particularly, one of the things Mike, I think, alluded to is that So if you do not live in a city, but you receive municipal services, who do you get them from? And the answer is your municipal utility district, right? Which is the closest thing you have to a local government in most of Mike's district, right? So one of the questions is, in the absence of annexation to the city of Houston, which may or may not be able to afford to provide those services anyway in the long run, can those services be successfully provided by municipal utility districts? Up to now,
And the county.
and the county. Up to now, the answer to that has been yes. In many of the older municipal utility districts, not necessarily the ones in your former district, but particularly in North and Northeast Houston, some of the older MUDs don't necessarily are beginning to struggle with long-term wastewater treatment issues, for example. They built their wastewater treatment plants maybe 30 years ago on the assumption that eventually you'd hooked into City of Houston sewer and you didn't need a permanent wastewater treatment system. So now it's 30 years later, somebody's going to have to rebuild that stuff. What's going to happen, right? That's why I said there is a price to be paid. The City of Houston's not going to annex. As the MUDs mature and the management of the MUDs boards moves from the developer to the residents, there's downward pressure on property taxes. Nobody wants to increase property taxes. And the county, which does provide some services, nevertheless has limited power and limited revenue. So then in a situation like that, what happens? In some cases, we've already seen MUDs in Northeast Houston, which are older, go to the county and say, give us federal block grant money to use to solve some of these problems. So what I'm saying is, I agree with just about everything Mike said. I think he's absolutely right about everything he said and everything you applauded to. I do think, however, in the long run, providing municipal type services to people who live in unincorporated areas does raise some issues, and especially some financial issues that are going to have to be dealt with by some combination of the City of Houston, other cities, the municipal utility districts, and Harris County.
And I'm sorry, guys, the audience already knows this, but because I'm a slow learner, let me ask this. When we say that a municipality has regulatory authority in the ETJ, what exactly are they telling people in the ETJ they can and cannot do? What kinds of regulations apply?
It mostly deals with what you can build on the property, what utilities you can put on there. It was designed so that you couldn't throw substandard stuff on there, which then got annexed and became part of the city. Now, one thing I didn't mention, when you're in the ETJ, you are not in the city limits, you cannot vote for the mayor and city council who are telling you how you use your property. Now, and one thing, I agree that we are going to have questions of how we're going to provide services out there, but I don't see how being an ETJ solves that. In fact, that makes you the stepchild of the city. If they annexed you, at least you'd be in the city. They still wouldn't provide the services.
At least you could vote.
And there are parts of my district that when you go out I-10, the city doesn't want the houses because it has to provide services. It just goes out I-10 and takes the businesses. And so it comes all the way out to where Katy is. Now, for those of you who aren't from that area, there's literally a finger, and I'll let you decide which one, that comes out I-10.
Look at the map.
Look on the map. That comes out, 20-something miles to the Katy Mills Mall. And it passes. Houston is a series of concentric circles. And by the way, I used to live within walking distance of Rice University. Not only is it a great university, but it's a wonderful place to live. But they're inside Loop 610, and then there's Beltway 8, and then there's Highway 6, and now the new Grand Parkway. And my district is out at the Grand Parkway. Well, the city limits come almost all the way out there. If you ever saw a fire truck from the city of Houston or a cop car out there, they must have got lost. Because those people are already in the city and cannot get a cop to respond to them, and the constable knows it. He knows he has to go patrol the city. The fire department, the Katy City Fire Department, has to go provide fire services in the city of Houston because the city won't do it. And the ESDs, the emergency services districts that we create to provide fire services in the county outside the city limits, they won't do it because it's not their jurisdiction. So Katy goes out there and hopes they get reimbursed. That's what the city of Houston does with territory it already has. If you're the stepchild, you got no shot of getting. So the idea that, well, we need to provide municipal services and the city will do it, the city will never do it. That's why, if they want to be in a city, it's imperative, and maybe not today, maybe not maybe when we're all dead, the people of Bridgeland decide they want to be a city. And they've got, by that time, 25,000 people, and they want to be a little city. They need to be able to make that decision for themselves, that they do want municipal services, and they do want to pay taxes for it, and they want a mayor, and they want to vote for him, they want that mayor to know who they are. That will never happen if we let and we were talking about the city of Houston, and many of you don't live anywhere near there, but what happens in Houston will come to you eventually because your cities are getting bigger. And that's why it's worth your effort to learn about what's happening there. It's coming.
Well, I would make so having framed the question.
I'm vituperative today. I don't know
having
what it is.
Having framed the question like that, well, you've been out of office, what, 3 days? Right? So you probably haven't
detoxify.
Right. Take my word for it, it's been 8 years. I'm still not detoxified. But having framed the issue that way, I think we're all in agreement that the current system of Houston holding on to this gigantic ETJ and not annexing is an unacceptable long-term solution. I think we can all agree on that. But I think that, but I do thank you for attempting to applaud, and I'm sorry I stepped on it. But I do think that as
Never step on your own applause
as you
lines.
think about, well, I've been out of office a while. As you think about options for reform, there are a couple of things to consider. One is, my observation would be, why is it that the city of Houston still has such an enormous extraterritorial jurisdiction? It is not entirely only because of the political power of the city of Houston. It is also because of the political power of the large master plan developers who build Bridgeland and other communities like that. They kind of like this system. So here's how this system works, right? They have to get their front end of this is for the large master plan developers. They have to get who are generally very good. I mean, Houston has the best large master plan developers in the country, but here's how it works. They have to go to the City of Houston Planning Commission in downtown Houston to get their project approved at the front end, right? This means that what they do is they make campaign contributions in the City of Houston to get a project approved which is never going to be located in the city of Houston, right? So for both the developer and the politician, this is a pretty good deal. We give you money for approval of something that is never going to affect you or your constituents, right? So everybody kind of likes that. And the other point I would make is that the developers, and they're very open about this, clearly like the municipal utility district system and prefer it because what they can do is, instead of incorporating the front end infrastructure cost of their development, this is the large developers again, into the cost of the house, they lay it off on the property taxes in the mud, right? So I guess part of what I'm saying is it's easy to make the city of Houston the bad guy here, and I don't deny that them hanging on to the ETJ is the wrong solution for the long run. But there are other political forces here at work that would have to be worked through in order for a solution to occur. Another point I would make, Mike made a really good point about the limited purpose annexations. You know, the city of Houston's getting something for nothing because they have leverage. I mean, it's that simple. But an interesting point is, these are 30-year agreements. These limited purpose annexations, many of them, and Mike's quite right, they only do a limited purpose annexation for the areas that have sales tax. It's not worth it to do it for anybody else, right? However, many of those limited purpose annexations will come up for their 30 years, and within about 10 years, they will begin to come up for renewal. So a question is, what happens then? Does the legislature intervene in the meantime and say, no, you can't renew them? Does the legislature say, I realize you're skeptical about this, City of Houston, you can only do that if you promise to, you can only renew it if you promise to provide services. If there is no deal currently between the MUD and the city, then that 1 penny sales tax goes uncollected and is not used for anybody's benefit. At least currently, half of that money goes for the benefit of the people who live in the MUDs, right? So I think these are...
Before we talk too much about you, can we see a quick show of hands of how many of you don't live anywhere near the city of Houston? That's not your part of the state. Okay.
How many of you live around San Antonio somewhere?
Okay.
Get ready for this.
Now, yeah, and that's my point. We're not just, this is not a Houston problem. Houston is there first. They've got it, but you're coming. And in fact, annexation was a problem we tried to deal with for years, And we were told that's a Houston problem, that's a Houston problem. They told us the old joke when Bob Bullock was lieutenant governor, when this kind of thing would come up, he would say, the Texas Senate will adjourn and the Houston City Council will now come to order. But a strange thing happened. We started, as the other cities started to get big too, we started to see, and it was when it hit San Antonio that there was enough impetus last session to pass the bill. And I can tell you, during the special session—
The bill that requires a vote.
the bill that requires a vote of the people to be annexed before you— and I can tell you, I was sitting in the back hallway, you know the famous back rooms that they talk about? There was no cigar smoke. I was sitting there with a laptop negotiating between two sets of members from San Antonio because that was the crux of the bill. So for those of you who aren't from Houston, this is not just a Houston thing. Houston got that big first. And the question is, what to do, and so when he said you're making Houston the bad guy, I'm not really. Houston is doing what you would expect a city to do. They're trying to maximize their revenue and minimize their cost.
Within the laws that currently exist.
And my thing is just let my people go.
Matt, let me bring you in. What say you?
That's the problem with ETJ, is it satisfies no one. And I'm feeling like a stepchild myself because normally I consider myself the only libertarian land use professor in Texas, and I get accused of being a right-winger with the law professors when I give talks about reducing land use restrictions and zoning regulations and having less regulation on property rights. And now all of a sudden I'm the Rice urbanist weenie in the TPPF crowd. But it is unsatisfactory to no one. Mike's earlier story about the Katy area constituents who said, please annex us. Right? I think that tells a lot about it because the ETJ satisfies no one because you're on the hook for taxes without the full panoply of services. But the alternative right now is MUDs and other, it's not really a conflict right now between seeing your mayor in the HEB or on the street versus having to deal with City Hall 40 miles away. I mean, that is definitely a reality, but the solution isn't less ETJ or less annexation. It could be, but you have to look at the alternative, which is maybe more incorporation at the local level, making more municipal governance, right? Because the scenario where people choose to live outside the city, while very compelling, that reality changes very quickly historically. It particularly in a vastly growing, the story Mike told about the rapid urbanization of the 20th century, that's entirely true. And these growth pressures to build suburbs, the idea that the ETJ was designed to clamp down on crappy development right outside the city limits where developers cash in and hightail it out of town, that's entirely true. But we have to ask ourselves, what's the solution? Is it's not a question between big city governance and no governance, right? An intermediary solution might have to be more dispersed governance. And I think I can make a libertarian case for both the idea that the ETJ is a big problem because you have sort of taxation without representation to channel into a deep American political current, but also when I said earlier, be careful what you wish for. Historically, the battle has been defensive incorporation versus annexation. And what I mean by that is smaller communities try to incorporate, right, and get those city powers in order to stave off the coming of the big behemoth urban megalopolis, right? So I think from, say, a libertarian perspective, we need to think about it more as, or less as kind of city versus not city, and think more pragmatically about, should it be big cities versus, or not versus, but big cities and small cities. That's what I meant by regionalism, right? Right now, ETJ is unaccountable, undemocratic for all those reasons that Mike has laid out, but so are MUDs. I mean, yeah, there's an election for the MUD chairman, the municipal.
Usually 4 people vote.
Yeah, 4 people vote. Nobody shows up at the meetings.
You can't even go to the Harris County Elections Board and find the results of the MUD elections.
And sometimes they give the notice of the MUD election literally by posting it at the wastewater treatment plant. Because we all know how often you go visit your wastewater treatment plant.
Right.
I tried to get I had a bill to make them put the notice of the election in your bill that they sent. They can find you every month to send you a bill, but they can't find you to send you an election notice. They came up, oh no, because it would have to be 87 pages long and all. But that's very true. But the question is, who decides? Are we going to have a bunch of us pointy-headed people somewhere in the central, office deciding what the area outside the city should look like, or do the people who live there get to decide? Now, currently, the folks in my area have a hybrid government. The county provides some of the services that a municipal government would provide. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for our county at all. And half of Harris County, by the way, is in the city of Houston, and the other half is either in small cities or unincorporated Harris County. We have like 2 million people in unincorporated
There are
Harris
more
County.
people in unincorporated Harris County than in
in
any other unincorporated, but also there are more people there living in unincorporated area in Harris County than in any other county in America.
And if those of you from Dallas County, you have almost no people in you're in some city or other. If you're not in Dallas, you're in Rowlett, you're in some place. And so it's different. But for most of Texas, if your cities are getting bigger, whether it's Lubbock or San Antonio or whatever, you're going to start to see this. And at some point, you're going to say, my area, wherever it is, in Houston, we're 30 miles away. You might just be 15 miles away from the core of Lubbock and feel that you don't really need to be governed by the folks who are inside because, they're governing for their interests and not for yours. But the question is, who gets to decide that? Now, right now, we've got a hybrid government. The county provides the police services through the sheriff's office and through the constable, and we have ESDs, emergency services districts, that provide the fire, and you have a MUD that provides these other things. And when you get your total property tax bill, you look at it and go, that's a hell of a tax bill, and I don't have a mayor. So you might decide, I'd rather have a mayor. To me, it's much more democratic to let those folks decide, and the solution might be different in Bridgeland, in the northern part of my district, than it is in an area outside of San Antonio or an area outside of Lubbock or somewhere in Collin County that's starting to grow bigger. And so why not let those folks decide if they're going to be in a city? And let those folks decide if they'd rather have a hybrid government, and maybe the next generation decides they want to be in a city. And the reason why I mentioned earlier about Houston being the example, look at the city of Houston. It has geographically gotten so much further than anything it can realistically govern that the area, and I used to live much further in than I do. I told you there are concentric circles. There's the loop, the 610 loop, then there's Beltway 8, and then there's Highway 6, and there's 9. I used to live right off the Beltway. I actually used to live right by Rice University, but then I moved a little further west. Eventually I'll be in San Antonio. But I was right at the Beltway in West
Right when that
Highland.
becomes a problem there, and then you can become the mayor of some city that will be created out there,
We
right?
can each have our own city we can be mayor of. But even at Beltway 8, that's only the second concentric circle out. They would never increase the amount of police protection even as the demographics change and it got rougher, and they have what they refer to as the SWAC in the southwestern area, and that it got bad. But the folks inside that loop who govern everything never really saw that and never really cared, and we couldn't get additional services, and we were relatively in compared to folks further out. The government that governs best is the government closest to you. Now, by the way, the government closest to you is inside the four walls of your home. But barring that, the next one is, and you will be better off with your own small city that attends to your needs. Believe me, when I go to a Katy City Hall meeting, people can get the attention of their mayor. And I mean, they can get the attention of their mayor. I love Sylvester Turner. He's a wonderful gentleman. Try getting the attention of Sylvester Turner if you live out near Katy. If you live in Clear Lake or Kingwood, he's got 2 million constituents.
He doesn't even know Kingwood's part of Houston.
And most of these, I mean, for decades, the city of Houston has looked at these outer places as ways I refer to as the Cotswold problem. That was one project. But to bring money inside the loop for things they care about in there without providing you any services. Everybody gets to decide how, or should get to decide how they're going to be governed. But how many of you want to be governed like that? How many of you want to be a stepchild in your own city? So as San Antonio grows, as Dallas grows, as Lubbock grows, as all these areas grow, you need to be thinking about, do I live 25 miles from Lubbock for a reason? I know what, and I always tell people in my district this, how many of you want to, and Dave's seen me do it in his group, I would say, how many of you live in the city limits of Houston? And no hands go up. I go, how many of you want to? No hands go up. I go, how many of you know where it is? All the hands go up. If you wanted to live in the city of Houston, you would. It shouldn't come out and get you.
See, the democratic localism argument for this, though, we have to realize that what we're talking about as a solution, right, there's two dimensions of this. One is you're in a city or you're not in a city. But the reality of Texas in 2019 is that most people are somewhere in between, like we're talking about here. And if you want to have a mayor, that means you have a city. And it may be a small city, and it may be more local, and it may be more responsive, but it's going to be a city. It's not going to be a not city, right? So that means home rule. That means a whole bunch of other powers for a local city government. You know, we can extol the virtues of localism, which are good, and I agree with all of them. And I agree with the idea that there should be some, you know, subsidiary principle towards having more responsive local governments. As an aside, even inside a giant city like Houston or Austin or Dallas or San Antonio, there's a competing pressure to get more local, to have these neighborhood associations, to have land use development tools to give more power to neighborhoods. So there is this hyper-localism at tension with the regional pole, but make no mistake, right? Local is good, but if local means more smaller cities, right, that can be unsatisfying to people on both ends of the political spectrum. And from a libertarian or conservative view, again, that's why I said earlier, be careful what you wish for, because I would suggest that if you were in a incorporated smaller city outside of Houston, you would find a lot of the same issues that you would find in a big city, which is once the city gets municipal powers, once the city gets home rule, it gets all the same powers to tax, to regulate, to zone, to tell you what you can and can't do with your property, right? So these are, you have to think through the whole kind of libertarian aspect of that, because while ETJ satisfies no one and the lack of accountability satisfies no one, the answer might be knowing your mayor, but if you have a mayor, that means you have a city council and you have home rule and you have a body of governance that has the exact same powers if it's a home rule municipality. And most of these ETJ areas have enough population to qualify for that. Exact same powers as Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, or Austin.
Matt, real quick. Let's just to bring the audience up to speed. Let's say you have a group of angry people in Houston's ETJ, and they want to incorporate because they don't want Houston city government ruling over them.
Well, they can't under the current.
Exactly. So can you explain how do those people get from point A to point B, or can they at all?
Well, right now they can't because of the ETJ. It's so big. If you look at it kind of in historical context, those areas weren't developed when the whole idea, you know, 3/4 of a century ago of kind of having this expansive ETJ. As Mike said, it was designed with an eye towards annexation. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a real issue that that ETJ's made it impossible to have the same kind of outer ring, smaller cities that you have in older places like the Northeast, where, you know, if you go to New York, Philadelphia, Boston, there's a million little tiny cities. That causes its own problems, which is something I was alluding to. You know, nobody likes to control their neighbors as much as a small city council or zoning commission or zoning board, right? So again, be careful what you wish for. But I agree with you, James. The idea of incorporating yourself is pretty much no can do right now, which is why I go back to Mike's story about please annex us, Katy. We'd rather be part of your small city than that big city, but it's still a city.
Well, I don't think there's any disagreement on the panel that the current system of ETJ, especially as it is, has manifested itself in Houston, is unsustainable. I don't think we're here to, we don't seem to be here to debate that. I think we all agree on that. I do think that, I guess my observation would be, which picking up what Matt said, is let my people go is not a solution in and of itself. It's an opening to a wider variety of options, and I think the state has to take action to make sure that those options are readily available. That those options, once you are released from the ETJ some way or other, your options might be to still annex to Houston or to annex to another city, to incorporate separately. You may be perfectly fine, happy with your MUD, but as Mike and I indicated, transparency with MUDs is an issue, and it may well be that the state needs to work more on making MUDs more transparent, so that if that is your local government, right, then you know where to find them, and you know who to complain to.
And let's mention that for a second. MUDs were not, when they were created, nobody was thinking about them acting as a government.
Which is what they're doing now.
And what they were thinking of was their initiation. In other words, building where this is all grass, we're going to build a subdivision here, and we're going to, or a planned unit development, or whatever it is, and let's use this to fund the infrastructure to start with. Nobody ever thought, you know, with it, they weren't paying much attention to.
Now they're doing parks. Now they're contracting with the sheriff or the constables for law enforcement services. They've essentially become the local government.
I've actually
and
seen
yet they aren't any more
signs.
transparent than they were before.
I've actually seen signs at the entrances to neighborhoods where you normally see "Welcome to our city." It says "Welcome to MUD number 28."
and when I worked for the governor, this first time we kind of ran into this issue, Governor Perry at one point said, they're creating a lot of these, they're creating by individual bills, they do different things. He said, I want a template. I want to know what's the best practices, what do we want to make sure is in there, like make sure there's a vote of the people before they can have taxes or raise them, make sure there's actually an election for the board. You know, a lot of the MUD bills list the members of the board in the statute. And so all that, well, what we found was different ideas. MUDs kind of were created in Harris County, largely by Joe B. Allen, and they were created for as a purpose that I said. And they had one way of thinking about it. This is how we build a subdivision. And so in the Houston area, people would say, we don't want MUDs having all these extended services, abilities to have roads. Literally, some have a transportation system they can own. But in North Texas, they said the exact opposite. The North Texas mayors and counties said, if they're going to have their own government over there and get their own money, I don't want to provide their roads. I don't want to make them do it. And so basically make them be a little city. And so you had these two competing ideas. We ended up with a rainstorm because you had a low pressure and a high pressure cloud coming together with each other. And that's when we found out that nobody had an overall plan for what we know what a city's supposed to look like and do. I mean, down to the, you'll go look at the local government code. Each layer of each city, from the smallest general law to up to the public to the charters, we all lay out exactly what they're supposed to do. We know what counties are supposed to do. We know what school districts are supposed to do. Nobody knows what a MUD's supposed to do. It's just in their individual statute.
Let me throw out this because I think it has some big implications for this issue. Recently, the city of McKinney lost its case against the Custer Storage Center up in North Texas. And so I'll go to our law professor. Can you explain what that potentially means for our current situation and how
I'm
that...
not super familiar with the case.
Okay.
Could you
No,
give
not a
little
problem.
background on it? What is the,
Well, so up in Collin County, there was a business by the name of Custer Storage Center, and they wanted to build a new facility out in the ETJ. And so they got a building permit from the county. The city didn't appreciate that, and so it took them to court stipulating that via Home Rule Authority, they had the regulatory authority to impose certain restrictions on them, and of course the business pushed back. And so the third court determined.
Stay on that right now? Is that the case I'm thinking of?
I believe that was settled, but
Okay.
Actually, I'm a member of the Commissioners Court and our county judge
Oh.
is here. I would love to give our county judge, Chris Hill, a chance to speak to that.
yeah, when we get to audience Q&A, Chris, we'll go right to you.
Now, for me, I'm not going to give professional legal advice without with attorney-client relationship. But I think it's, and we'll hear more, but I think it's representative of the really the rising. You're seeing similar cases, not similar to that actual issue, but the issue of home rule powers versus their limitations. These are coming up in all kinds of contexts, and that's why I kind of started off with trying to frame this in the rising and more noticed, not just in Texas but nationally, the conflict kind of between state law and local home rule powers. Right? Home rule says that you can annex, but the state has passed laws that limit the power to annex. And that stuff is really being worked out, not just in annexation, but in things like land use regulation, city powers to regulate commerce, whether it's fracking or plastic bags or straws or a lot of other things. This is a real area of legal tension, and Texas is just a part of it. You see it all across the country right now. It's kind of the topic du jour of local governance, home rule versus state authority.
And I want to get this last question in, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. We, of course, have a legislative session going on. If you guys had one recommendation to give any of our legislative staff out there on how to reform this current situation, is there anything that comes to mind?
First thing I would do is take all the Schofield bills from last session and pass them.
I would do what I sort of suggested a minute ago, which would be to combine a let my people go approach with a refined and sustainable set of alternatives, so that it's not just releasing the ETJ. It's making so that local people around the state are clear on what their alternatives are, what the pros and cons are, how sustainable they are, and that they're all transparent.
But understand that is the sticking point. The reason why I focus on the ETJ and all that is the cities, and particularly the big ones, don't want to give it up. Right. And so, you can say letting somebody out of prison isn't the answer. They have to get a job and all that, but they can't even apply for jobs until they're out of jail. And
we're not disagreeing about that.
I mean, we have to be able to break that lock. And I think what we're seeing here from all of us is that as this state fills up with people, we used to have so much land, we traded 3 million acres in order to build the Capitol. We had tons of land. Now we're filling up with people. It's not just that we have more people, but we have so many more that the concept has changed. We can't use the same structure that we had in 1950 and 1960. And the question to me, so I'm going to change my takeaway. My takeaway is, as we look at how we should adjust this going forward, how do we make sure that our solution serves the people and not the government?
I think I'm the only non-former politician on the panel, so I'm not trained to not step on applause. But I think quick takeaway for the legislature is whether it's annexation, property rights, business regulation, I think we need to look at the state versus local battle as not something that's dug in, but that it shouldn't be just about substantive results. It shouldn't be just about substantive policy, but about promoting a theory of mixed powers between state and local governments that allows for local control, but state sovereignty.
Why don't we transition now to our audience Q&A. Commissioner Hill, thank you for joining us. Let's see. Did he sneak out? No, I'm sorry, Judge Hill. Judge, how are you, sir? Sorry, the lights are a little blinding. Shelby, if you would. Did you want to update us on the court case? Is there anything that you can help educate our audience on?
Thank you, sir. I didn't have any questions.
Okay.
Well, you got a shout out. That's the important thing.
I didn't have any questions, but I will tell you the update on the case. The city of McKinney, our county seat, did sue Collin County, where I serve as the county judge, to sue us in 2 different lawsuits, Custer Storage that you referred to, and a second, Arts Resorts, both lawsuits over the same fact pattern. They did not appreciate the fact that the county had permitted construction out in the ETJ on private property projects that were out in ETJ. And we did, as a county, advise them that that was outside their authority, and they disagreed, and they sued the county twice, and they sued the landowners as well, and the county prevailed in both of those cases. And so we have restored the balance of power there between the city in the ETJ and the county government.
And so that case has been decided at the appellate level. Do you guys anticipate going up to the Texas Supreme Court?
They've all gone through, they've been settled completely, and in fact, the city has decided not to appeal their loss further, so they're finished finally.
Good enough. Thank you, Judge.
I will say this last thing from the county's perspective, that Representative Schofield is exactly correct, that the answer here is to eliminate the extraterritorial jurisdiction. Now that annexation rules have changed in the state, quite frankly, the ETJ does not serve the purpose that it used to serve. And until that time that the ETJ is eliminated, you don't even have these other opportunities for communities to incorporate on their own, for them to stay under the power of the mud. All of those options that we talked about and that the panel has discussed, they don't exist until such time that the ETJ is eliminated in its current fashion.
Why don't we go to, yes, ma'am. I know you had something to add on that case.
Just to add on the issue itself. Susan Fletcher, Collin County Commissioners Court. I would like to hear from the panel, just because we had like 1445 agreements, and I'm sure the panel's familiar with that, with the cities, which we believe, and I won't speak for all of my colleagues, but it is a platting authority, which is not vertical building authority, and I would like to hear what the panel has to say about, differentiating those, and I would love to see legislation that actually clarified much more in the law on that issue.
Panel, what say you?
Let's go to the law professor.
1445, I don't recognize the number. Are these the platting authority? Okay.
So they would go to the city for platting authority.
Even though they're in the ETJ?
Exactly.
Okay,
But it's
right.
an agreement that we have with the city.
Right, it's a form of...
Ceded that authority, yes.
Sure, and I think, Bill was talking about this earlier, and if you look at the Kinder Institute's report on this, it talks about the different types of agreements that can be made between municipalities and areas in the ETJ, and so this being one of those. I think it's sort of a species of what I've been trying to get across about be careful what you wish for, because that's an extension of land use control outside the city limits. As the previous comment was that ETJs have sort of outlived what they were designed for. They were designed for that. In other words, keep the shoddy, make sure we have some planning and land use control as the development expands beyond the core. Do you have a concern with the property rights aspect of it, or?
It's more the vertical construction versus the platting authority, which was the original agreement, was platting only, which is.
By vertical construction, you mean physically vertical?
Physically, like coming to, so if they're gonna build on that property, they're not gonna subdivide the property. They're gonna build on their one piece of property.
Oh, and
They
the,
wanna build their retirement home, which is an actual case as well, retirement home. And the city thinking.
On one piece of property.
Come to inside the city for a building permit when they live outside
Sure, and that's I mean that's a species of what land use regulation is today, which is more and more government control over the form and the size, and so if I understand correctly, what was designed to sort of regulate platting in terms of how the space, the physical land gets developed, now it's going to the buildings themselves, things like that. Yeah.
To control the vertical construction and wanting that landowner outside of the city limits that can't vote for the city, leadership
Right.
to come into the city and pay for additional permits and all of that.
I think that's nothing new as much as a new application of the authority that's been there all along, and probably signifies a trend. And this is why I send a cautionary note to the conservatives in the room. Municipal power means the power to do all that, to zone and regulate and prescribe form, and which is a property rights issue.
And I think in the long run, if ETJs do go away or diminish, one of the questions becomes, do or should counties have more of that kind of power, which traditionally they have not had in Texas, for the very reason that Matt described, right? Is that really what you want counties to do? I think that's a kind of fundamental question at the state
But now
level.
don't forget, it always reminds me of in Houston, whenever they talk about, what if we had zoning, and I'm typically against it if I get the opportunity.
I think we sort of do, but
And
that's
they'll-
another
yeah,
conversation.
But they'll say, as if it was from Mars, what would happen if we had it? I'm like, well, the whole rest of the state has it. Look there. It's the same thing with, what would happen if the city doesn't get the ability to regulate an ETJ? Well, even the biggest city only has 5 miles of ETJ. Look 1 foot past it, and there's your answer. And we haven't had a tremendous problem. Nothing's fallen down in my part of the world. The people's houses are fine. We're not having, a bunch of fire traps. I mean, folks can manage their own stuff. I don't really think that's the problem. I think the problem is who decides. And as cities get further and further from their core, should it be somebody 30 miles away, or should you and your neighbors decide how you want to be governed? Now, I do want to speak to Judge Hill's point for a minute, because he said something that we didn't really mention, which is Senate Bill 6. Once we passed a bill that required the approval of the people to be annexed before annexation could occur, we effectively neutered the whole reason why we had ETJs in the first place. Nobody is on deck to be annexed unless you agreed to be. So why do we have a wide halo of area that a city that you're never going to agree to be part of gets to decide how you have to live your life and use your property?
Now, that's mostly true, but there are a fairly large subsection of counties and cities out there who still have that authority.
Or step one, now we're on step two.
Good.
In fact, by the way, we had people, everybody assumes that the reason why they created the two, if you're above 500,000, you get it. If you're below 500,000, you don't, was they were afraid they couldn't get the votes of the rural members. Rural members were starting to hear from people going, why am I not covered by this?
Yeah. Good point. I know we got a lot of questions out there. Yes, sir.
I would like to know from the panel members where liberty comes in your views, and by that I mean the fact that within ETJs we have control exerted upon us without voting. And you mentioned about the non-transparency of MUDs, but we have a vote within the MUDs. And if you're an activist like myself, you can have your vote in the MUD, and it weighs a lot because not very many people vote. So I'd like your response to the liberty aspect of what we're talking about.
Before they answer, I can give you the U.S. Supreme Court's answer. In Holt versus Civic Club of Tuscaloosa, the Supreme Court in 1978 ruled, the U.S. Supreme Court, our Supreme Court would never be this foolish, ruled that it was perfectly fine within equal protection, didn't violate equal protection, didn't violate due process, for a city to regulate your property without you having any vote for mayor or council. It's an insane decision. It was welcome to the burger court, I guess. But same people that gave you Roe versus Wade 5 years later weren't any smarter. But that's the framework that we operate under. That's why they're allowed to do it. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it a good idea. And you, Dave, you know my position on it. So I'll let these gentlemen answer.
Well, I think my answer to that is that most development rules are established at the front end, no matter who's establishing them, right? So if you are moving into a subdivision, you are buying into a whole set of development rules, including your HOA rules, including the MUD services you are provided, and including the original development regulations that were worked out between the city and the developer in the city whose ETJ you're in. So I'm not sure, I think this raises the, this goes to the, I guess part of my answer is, when you buy a house, you are buying into a pre-existing set of rules that presumably you know what they are and you accept them.
Unless they annex a little further and all of a sudden you're within a 5-mile ETJ where you weren't when you bought.
Right, but
I got neighbors like that.
But I do think that most people in the ETJ in Harris County who live inside MUDs, and I'm speaking of Harris County here, who live inside MUDs, live in that situation. And oftentimes people buy a house without knowing what all the rules are, without knowing what the HOA rules are. But that is a pre-existing set of rules that is set up at the front end that include nobody who lives there, or almost nobody who lives there. And I'm not sure how you institute liberty in that situation.
Yeah, and I would add to both of those comments by saying it depends on which trajectory you're putting liberty, because there's a procedural liberty and there's a substantive liberty. And the representation part means, like you said, being able to vote for your MUD board or your mayor or your city council, whatever abstraction level that's at, but substantive liberty, property rights, the freedom to use your land and build what you want, is on a different dimension. And whether it's the big city, the small city, the MUD, or the HOA, property rights are going to be controlled to the extent that those in power want to control them, right? So just to add to Bill's point, we can talk about government all we want, and I advocate for less zoning and less regulation in my work, but I've never seen any regime that's more restrictive of individual property rights than the private covenants of homeowners associations. So,
Real quick, I think we got time for 2 more questions. Annie?
One of the points that was made was that annexation only makes sense for the sales tax, and that's why sometimes they make these offshoots and draw these lines for ETJs, you know, the fingers to bring in the businesses. Can y'all talk about how is this affecting water? We have huge density increases. Are these ETJs controlling well drilling? Are they controlling where water gets? Are they using this to take water from other areas?
I mean, that's why you have MUDs in the first place, right?
And these 7 other kinds of water districts we have. Before we had any of this problem, Texas started dealing with water by, first we just had the rule of capture. Anybody, anywhere, whatever you could drill, you could get. And then we started creating water districts, and they were the minority. They were just a few places. Now almost the entire state is in one water district or another. So you have that layer of government to deal with in addition to the city. If you actually were annexed, then you have the provision of water from the city. But if you're in what we're talking about, ETJ or any of these other things, and what he was referring to when he said it only made sense if there's a sales tax was something called limited purpose annexation, where they go out to a MUD or another unit of government and say, everything in your area we're going to annex unless you give us the money. Well, they give them the money. And so, and he mentioned the part where they, and I'll point this out.
Otherwise, they don't get it at all.
Well, that's one type. The other type is where they go to a MUD that already has taxing authority and say, give me half your money that you already have, or we're just going to annex you, take it all, and throw you out. And so, and they have done that. That's a whole nother issue because it really only behooves the city. That's a bluff because they really only want to take you on once you've paid off all your debt. They don't want your debt. But so he wasn't talking about annexation in general only makes sense. He was talking about limited purpose annexations where you go to that MUD. Well, that MUD is going to pay the ransom, and they're still going to provide you the same water that you did before. And by the way, I wasn't, when I was talking about the transparency of MUDs, I wasn't, you know, the actual conduct of the MUD depends on the MUD. I live in MUD 81 in Harris County. It's a great MUD. I get water, sewer, and garbage for less than I would figure I could probably make a deal to pay for those on the private market. So I love my mud, you know, but again, it's my mud. And yes, you know, nobody ever knows when the elections are, but we can find out. And my goal with my bill was to make it more obvious that you would know. They would have to send you a letter telling you when it was time to file in case you wanted to run, and then they have to send you another one telling you when the election was. If we did that, instead of, we've had elections in people's garages, we've had elections where when they ran out of ballots, they just tore off a corner of a piece of paper and handed it to you. If we had real elections, you might find that you liked your mud and you'd rather have that than a city, but let you decide.
Real quick, Robin Lennon, you get the last word.
As always.
That's
That's because I talk a lot. I just want to talk to those of you who haven't experienced this the way Kingwood, Texas did, when Houston jumped over the city of Humble to annex us. And I just want to reinforce what the activist over there had said before about the ease of actually working for change in smaller area groups, like when you know your mayor. What Houston did to us is that at the same time that they forcibly annexed Kingwood, they went south of the city and also annexed Clear Lake City, and then they drew one of those little pencil lines between us so that the two communities wouldn't provide two conservative voices on city council. So it's much easier to organize in a smaller group than it is in the city of Houston.
Hey, we come as a set sometimes. I'm Jim Lennon. I'm married to Robin. One thing I wanted to point out, the city of Houston, you also acquired the city's liabilities when we got annexed. All of a sudden, we were responsible for their pension obligations for the firemen and the policemen. Every 2 years, the mayors make promises to the city workers. Will guarantee you 8.5% in your pensions for the rest of your life. We'll guarantee you your medical plans. And then all of a sudden, like magic, it's our responsibility and not the mayor's responsibility. So you get the liabilities also.
good point, Jim.
If I could close with
Please.
one thing, but I don't want Commissioner Fletcher and Judge Hill to leave without knowing that my desk mate, Matt Shaheen, says hi. I learned everything I knew about county government from him, so thank you all very much for nurturing it.
Folks, please help me thank this great panel.